the Legal Corner podcast series. Welcome to today's episode of The Legal Corner, a podcast which covers a variety of legal issues to keep you informed. Hosted by attorney at law Colin Dinoon and communications specialist Leonardo Torres.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Legal Corner podcast series. I am your host, Colin Dinoon, attorney at law. My co-host, Mr. Leonardo Torres, is absent today because of work commitments. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the operations of the Tobago House of Assembly. The current iteration of the Tobago House of Assembly, commonly referred to as the THA, was established by virtue of the proclamation of the Tobago House of Assembly Act in December 1996. This legislation delineates the responsibilities of the THA and provides mechanisms through which decisions are made relative to Tobago. The average citizen who does not reside in the island of Tobago may not know much about the THA, and it is for this reason that we decided to dedicate an episode to this topic. Joining me on the show today to provide some perspective on this is Mrs. Adanna Joseph-Wallace, attorney at law. Mrs. Joseph-Wallace first graced us with her presence in episode 3, where we were able to have a lively discussion on the issue of Tobago autonomy. So those of you who would have joined us further along in our journey, you can feel free after this episode is ended to go back through our catalog and listen to that interesting episode. Mrs. Joseph-Wallace is a passionate advocate for Tobago. She's a wife and mother, and she is also a university lecturer. Good day to you, Adanna, and welcome to the Legal Corner.
Good afternoon, Colin, and thank you for again. It's my pleasure to be here.
Excellent. It's great to have you. I want us to get into this discussion on the THA, and I want you to tell us what is the structure of the THA. How many assemblymen make up this THA?
Well, before I even get into the structure, I want to say that very often people use the THA, the Tobago House of Assembly, interchangeably with the Executive Council, interchangeably with the Executive Council and the minority together, right? But when we're speaking about the Tobago House of Assembly, we're speaking about that body corporate that is that it's there in our constitution that says there shall be a Tobago House of Assembly, but more specifically, its functions and purposes are spelt out or prescribed rather, let me use the correct word, prescribed in the Tobago House of Assembly Act. And in terms of the number of assemblymen, if you may or may not remember, there have been 2 very recent elections in the Tobago space in terms of the Tobago House of Assembly. So initially, there would have been 12 assemblymen. So prior to the legislative amendment, because if you remember, there was the election, I can't remember, I think it was 2020, and there was 6-6. So there were 12 electoral districts. So that's why there was 6-6. That was the result because there were 12 assemblymen. So there was a legislative amendment by Act number 2 of 2021 so now there are 15 electoral districts for the Tobago House of Assembly election. So there are now 15 assemblymen, However, that wouldn't, if I just say how many assemblymen there are, that doesn't really give you a true picture of the members of the assembly, which would include the Executive Council as well as the minority, but there are also councillors. And there are 3 councillors appointed by the presiding officer on the advice of the chief secretary. and there's also one counselor who is, well, the minority counselor. So that gives an idea. So in this present iteration, that would mean we have 15 plus 4, the 4 counselors, which would give you 19 in all when you look at the assembly legislature.
Right, interesting. I like the idea that you raised concerning the councillors, because we honestly do not hear much necessarily being mentioned as it relates to those councillors. I heard you mention the presiding officer. Tell us a bit about the powers and the role of the presiding officer.
Okay, well, I will just go back a bit to treat with the counselors, since you say very often persons don't hear. Probably because if you're outside of Tobago, because I don't think anybody ever really pays much mind to what happens in Tobago except for persons resident on the island. Counselors may be appointed as secretaries, and I guess we get to that later on when we look more at the structure. So for the person listening on, they may just hear secretary this or assistant secretary that. And sometimes those persons may be counselors. So for example, on the executive side, on executive council side, we have 3, as I said, we have 3 counselors. 2 are assistant secretaries in the person, of Miss Sutika Williams, or who is in the office of the chief secretary, Mr. Orlando Cole, who is the assistant secretary in the division of education, technology, and research and technology. The name is kind of long. DUTECH is the name. And then there's Miss Tashia, Boris, who was appointed the Secretary for Tourism, Culture, Transportation, and the Antiquities. Another really long name for a division. And of course, on the other side, which is on the minority side, we have the minority councillor, Ms. Petal Daniel Benoit. In terms of the presiding officer, well, as I just spoke about councillors, I would have mentioned one of the functions of the presiding officer actually in terms of the Section 9.1 of the THA Act provides that the presiding officer, acting in accordance with the advice of the chief secretary, appoints 3 councillors, and the minority leader, in terms of the minority leader, the presiding officer would appoint 1 councillor on the advice of the minority leader, who now, of course, you may or may not know, is Mr. Kelvin Morris, and the chief secretary, of course, is Mr. Fali Augustine, right? So according to the Trinidad and Tobago Constitution, and I'm getting to the substantive question that you asked, which is about the presiding officer, Section 141A.2, the assembly shall consist of a presiding officer and such other members qualified and appointed in such manner and holding office upon such terms and conditions as may be prescribed. Now, if you'll notice the wording of that section in the Constitution, it sort of reminds me of our 75 one with regard to the constitution of your cabinet. Yes, 75, where it's the prime minister and the AG and then other ministers. So in essence, this is just in the same way that is interpreted. We could probably interpret the THA Act the same way, this provision, this constitutional provision anyway, that there is no assembly without a presiding officer. So loosely, the presiding officer is the equivalent. Is just make, when I say loosely, to make it very simple for people to understand, because most persons are familiar with the Speaker of the Parliament, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So we can say that your presiding officer is more or less the Speaker of the Assembly Legislature. But of course, the person is called the presiding officer. Why I say that there's we can look at it very loosely as the same thing, it's because the presiding officer represents the assembly legislature, And recently we had the presiding officer in attendance at the 11th Commonwealth Youth Parliament held at the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. The presiding officer is the Assembly Legislature spokesperson. The presiding officer is the person who presides over the sittings in the Assembly Legislature. So, as I said before, normally when people hear the Tobago House of Assembly, they may just think of the Executive Council. But there's a presiding officer because there's also the Assembly Legislature, which performs a quasi-legislative function. And I say quasi-legislative because even though there may be debating there similar to Parliament and bills may be debated upon there, the Assembly has not yet passed any law. Actually, any bill emanating from the Assembly must go to Cabinet first. Yes? So I hope that answers your question.
Excellent.
And I may just mention that the current presiding officer is Ms. Abby Taylor. She was the PDP candidate for Darrell Spring Whim. She was unsuccessful. She lost to Kelvin Morris, who is the minority leader, about 3 or 2 votes or something like that. But when you're in the position of the presiding officer, you're supposed to be neutral and impartial. So she would have had to remove that political hat as the presiding officer, as I said, presiding over these assembly sittings in a very neutral and impartial manner, and of course, according to the standing orders of the Assembly Legislature.
Right. Now, the Chief Secretary, it would be fair to say, is leader in Tobago. He has his team that he is in charge of. So I want you to tell us, how is he appointed?
Persons seem to have a mix up with, and I guess that comes from people being more familiar with Parliament and a Prime Minister, right? But a Chief Secretary is not appointed in the same way that a Prime Minister is appointed. The Chief Secretary is actually elected, not by a general election, so not by a Tobago House of Assembly election, but by the assemblymen in the chamber at the sitting. Then a person is nominated, or more than one person could be nominated, actually. So this allows, that is again why you need a presiding officer, a must-have in terms of the Tobago House of Assembly, because the presiding officer would be presiding over that sitting, so that a chief secretary could be elected by the assemblyman there, right? So the chief, someone appoints, someone seconds, and then there is an election. Now, of course, I started off by mentioning the 6-6. So imagine a situation where there is a tie. You would have a difficulty in, number one, most likely will have a difficulty in electing not just a presiding officer, but a chief secretary as well. Yes. So that is to just distinguish that the chief secretary is not appointed.
That is what would have happened the last time when there was that 6-6 deadlock, and attempts were made to have some sort of cooperation between the both parties, but it was unsuccessful.
Yes. So the starting point would have been after the swearing in of the persons elected, all right, successful at the polls. The next step would have been to try to elect a presiding officer. And there were two persons nominated. The PDP would have nominated Mr. Julian Skeet, and the PNM would have nominated Miss Ingrid Melville. Of course, if you have 6 on either side, then none may have moved forward, right? And the reason why no party may have wanted to say, okay, we're going to allow for this other party's nominee to be the presiding officer is because the presiding officer has a casting vote. Yes. So in essence, if you allowed possibly, if you allow someone to be the presiding officer in a situation where there's a 6-6, that person in exercising a casting vote will be the tiebreaker. Yes, and so that is again that is one of the curious features of the Tobago House of Assembly and the Tobago House of Assembly legislature in particular. But it's not so curious as to be unheard of, because we would have had a similar situation in Trinidad when there was the 1818 deadlock following the general elections. But again, in the parliament, the president appoints a prime minister, and Patrick Manning was appointed. But there were serious challenges with the appointment of with electing a speaker and appointing a speaker. So of course there was no speaker, and there were implications for that moving forward, arising from that moving forward.
Of course, and to any of our young listeners who may not recall that time, there definitely was an occasion where there was an 1818 deadlock. Previously, there used to be 36 seats in the House of Representatives,
yes,
and hence the reason there was a tie. And in fact, it was changed to 41 as a result of the problems and the challenges that arose given that tie. Right?
Yes, but of course, there was no difficulty in selecting or appointing a prime minister, because, as I said, it's not the same process as what obtains in the Tobago House of Assembly, so that an 1818 configuration did not affect the appointment of a prime minister by the president.
Right. Is there anything in the legislation that specifies any particular roles for the chief secretary?
Yes and no. I say this because the role of the Tobago House of Assembly as a whole is to formulate and implement policy for Tobago in relation to those matters that are delineated in your Schedule 5 of the Tobago House of Assembly Act, right? So the Act says that's the function of the Assembly. Now, the Chief Secretary is the head of the Executive Council, and it's not the same as your cabinet, but think of it in the same way as a cabinet, responsible for formulating policy. So that is the executive branch there in terms of this decentralized authority or devolved authority that Tobago has by virtue of its Tobago House of Assembly. So, of course, your chief secretary, bearing in mind that the role of the Tobago House of Assembly is to formulate and implement policy with regard to Tobago for those matters, as I said, contained in your 5th schedule, as the person who is in charge of the Executive Council, and the Executive Council itself performing the functions of formulating and implementing policy, then by virtue he is in charge of the policy direction of the assembly. And it also means as well that the chief secretary uses his discretion to determine which of his assemblymen may become secretaries for divisions, or who may be appointed councillor, revoking appointments as well, right? So those are the responsibilities of your chief secretary. There's also the fact that your chief secretary is sort of the face of Tobago and governance in Tobago, so that he is representative of Tobago as a whole. So it's not just in terms of the policy formulation and implementation, not just in terms of choosing who may be councillors, or secretaries or assistant secretaries and so on. The chief secretary is really the face of Tobago, the pulse of Tobago. The chief secretary is also supposed to embody the aspirations and ideals of Tobagonians. I say that, and it's a lot for a person who is not a head of state, but still a member of the executive charge with certain particular responsibilities. So whereas you normally think that this symbolic role of being indicative of the state is the function of your president, right? In a Tobago context, I am not saying that the chief secretary supplants the role of the president. No, I'm saying that very often in the minds of persons, they equate Tobago's aspirations and ideals with the person who holds the seat of the chief secretary. And of course, before that, there would have been a chairman of the Tobago House of Assembly when the assembly came back into being in 1980. I say came back into being because before the union with Trinidad, I think it was in 1889. 1889? I can't remember exactly the year, but it was a long time ago. Before that union, there would have been a Tobago House of Assembly. Sometime following the union, there was no longer a Tobago House of Assembly, and then went back to a Tobago House of Assembly in 1980. If I am not mistaken, I think the Assembly legislature in Tobago is even older than the seat of governance in Trinidad. So that's interesting there. So that's why I said part of the role of the chief secretary is an embodiment of the ideals and aspirations of Tobagonians, because he or she embodies these ambitions and well, I don't want to say independence, but some measure of self-determination and being responsible for selfness of the Tobagonian in the Tobago space. So I hope I made that clear to you. Yes, because there are historical antecedents which follow there being a chief secretary, as I said, or what used to be called the chairman of the Tobago House of Assembly. Okay. There's a lot of history there.
At this point, we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back. Okay, welcome back and thank you for staying with us. Adanna, before the break, you were talking to us about the chief secretary's role, and you also gave us some nice history, given the fact that it was once called the chairman of the THA as opposed to the chief secretary. We want to talk now a bit about the deputy chief secretary. Is the process of appointment the same as the chief secretary for the deputy chief secretary?
Well, thank you. We've come back from the break. As I would have said before, the chief secretary is not appointed but elected, and it's similar with the deputy chief secretary. So recently, and we had a very good example of this being done recently when Mr. Watson Duke would have resigned his position as deputy chief secretary. There was a special sitting of the assembly legislature, for the purpose of electing a new deputy chief secretary. So the process is essentially the same as the election of a chief secretary, meaning that person is nominated, someone seconds, and there's a vote and so on, right? What I would want to say additionally is that in terms of your chief secretary, I know I was giving a little bit of the history and so on and the functions of the chief secretary, but I also want to mention that notwithstanding what I would have said before, that does not mean that the assembly's performs or takes away the function of your cabinet. Because every responsibility of the Tobago House of Assembly and its executive in particular, it will, of course, be subject to your Section 75(1) in your constitution, because, as you know, the political executive, which would be your prime minister and his or her cabinet, they're responsible for the day-to-day administration of the state, of course, along with the permanent executive, which is your public service, right? So in that regard, you have the fact that the chief secretary and the prime minister are supposed to meet regularly. Now, we are dealing with politicians here, so politics sometimes come into it. And there has been no interpretation of what regularly means. And why I mention this is because when Mr. Orville London was the chief secretary and Mrs. Kamla Persad Bissessa was the prime minister, there became a bit of um how do I say this? Became a bit of an issue in Tobago with regard to what regularly meant, so that it was felt that they were not meeting regularly or not frequently or not meeting at all, right? Because of course the legislation does not say what regularly means, and perhaps there has been no settled practice with regard to what regularly means. And these things a lot of times, these things that are in legislation come to a head when especially in the Tobago context, when you're dealing with two different administrations. So at that time, there would have been UNC in power in the central government in Trinidad and PNM in Tobago in the Tobago House of Assembly. That's where I'm speaking about Mr. Orville London and Mrs. Kamla Persad Bissessa. So perhaps we may find a similar issue coming to the fore this time around, where there are two different administrations in the two seats of power in the state, right? One being in Tobago and one being in Trinidad. And apart from those regular meetings, and regular I will put in inverted commas, based on what I just said, the chief secretary is also to provide an annual report to the prime minister about the assembly work, what the assembly has done for the year. So I think it's up to the 31st of December, and then this report is to be issued by, I think, April of the following year. And the chief secretary may be invited to cabinet meetings to speak about matters affecting Tobago, to contribute. But of course, the chief secretary, well, I shouldn't say but of course. However, on those invitations, the chief secretary does not have a vote in the cabinet. So it's just there to talk, but doesn't. Hopefully that you're so charismatic and informative that people hold your point of view or come around to your point of view, because you don't have a vote in cabinet and you have to be invited, as I said.
Right. All right. Excellent. Now, so we spoke about the deputy chief secretary in terms of being elected and not appointed. What is his role? What is the role of the deputy secretary in practicality?
Okay, well, again, we have some very good examples in the public space. Again, using Mr. Watson Duke. Well, very often, or more often than not, in the past, your deputy chief secretary would have also been a secretary, meaning that person had responsibility for a division. So there was Mr. Joel Jack, who was the deputy chief secretary, and he was also secretary for finance, right? So you've had situations like that. So there is no requirement, as far as I can see in the legislation, that says that your deputy chief secretary has to be a secretary or to be assigned any particular portfolio, right? In terms of what would have obtained with Mr. Watson Duke, what was stated in the public space was that what was going to happen was a build out of the office of the deputy chief secretary in a way that was not done before. So he would have been, he would have been assigned responsibility for several areas that we normally we did not hear about in other administrations, which would have been energy, diaspora affairs, and matters related to autonomy. Now, of course, as I said, he is no longer the deputy chief secretary. The person who is the deputy chief secretary is Dr. Faith B. Israel, who, before she became deputy chief secretary, she is and continues to be the secretary for health, wellness, and social protection. So we're sitting in the public space and we're waiting to see if the build out that occurred or was supposed to occur with Mr. Watson Duke would now take place with Dr. Faith B. Israel, whether there would be some changes, there would be changes to her portfolio and so on. But again, going back to what I would have said about the chief secretary, these are things that are done in his discretion. So we will sit and wait and see, because as I said, the legislation does not separate and apart from saying that the assembly is responsible for formulating and implementing policy. It doesn't say, well, the deputy chief secretary has to do this or that.
Now, in the legislation, certain areas are outlined for which the Executive Council has responsibility. So I want you to walk us through those areas.
Well, that might be a really long walk, because there are about 33 areas listed in the fifth schedule.
Well, they can just tell us some. We can just,
yeah. So we can say, well, the executive, as I said, the assembly is responsible for policy formulation and implementation in Tobago. So the executive council has responsibilities which include devising mechanisms for ensuring the protection and security of property, buildings, and other assets under the assembly's control, entering into contracts as it deems fit for the efficient discharge of its functions, and I guess any functions incidental to those things, obtaining from international donors any grant aid or technical assistance. No, this is not to be confused with international relations, because that is one of the areas under the seventh schedule that is definitely not under the remit of the Tobago House of Assembly. Where there is a statutory authority or state enterprise which provides services in Tobago, that statutory authority or state enterprise, in exercising its duties in relation to those services, may in accordance with the policy, may act in accordance with the policies or programs of the assembly, and may even enter into a MOU, memorandum of understanding, with the assembly to fulfill those responsibilities. So the assembly may act as an agent for the government or statutory authority for those matters listed in the sixth schedule. Now, to go specifically to those areas that you would have asked me about in the fifth schedule, so you have finance, that is to say the collection of revenue and the meeting of expenditure incurred in carrying out the functions of the assembly, state lands, land and marine parks. And that is a very interesting one, because there is a case in the past, Barry Lazo, I can't remember the full name, but Barry Lazo was one of the claimants brought against the Tobago House of Assembly and the Attorney General, where an incident occurred at the Pigeon Point Heritage Park in and you know that iteration of the Tobago House of Assembly claimed that it was not responsible for that particular part of the sea. That is a central government function. Well, the court rubbished that proposition. It's also responsible for museums, public buildings, maintenance of the residence of the Prime Minister and President, tourism, sports, culture and the arts, community development, cooperatives, agriculture, fisheries, food production, forestry, library services, health services, licensing, customs and excise, and on and on. As I said, there are 33 areas. Now, the matters which THA may not be responsible for in the sixth schedule: the President, National Security, Foreign Affairs, Civil Aviation, Meteorology, Immigration, legal affairs, including the registration of legal documents, the Judiciary, Auditor General, Ombudsman, Service Commission. And then there are the seventh schedule matters, services which are to be performed or delivered in Tobago, and it would include Supreme Court services, service commissions, ombudsman, and so on and so on. So depending on the nature of the function being performed it may fall into either the 5th schedule, which is the total remit of the Tobago House of Assembly, the 6th schedule, or the 7th schedule, as the case may be. And that would determine whether the Tobago House of Assembly has the sole remit of responsibility for it, or something that is the agent of the state for, or no responsibility at all for, as the case may be.
All right. Now, in practice, are there usually disputes as it relates to who is responsible for what between the THA and the central government?
Disputes. I would say eruptions with an I rather than E. Sometimes occur, of course, because we are looking at it from a legal perspective, but we're dealing with politicians. And there's always case law on it. So I can tell you that there was a matter before it went before Justice Kangaloo, if I remember correctly, Tobago House of Assembly against the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, where the Ministry of Forestry or something, whatever it was called at that time, because these ministry names change with each administration. There was a reforestation program being done in Tobago, and the Tobago House of Assembly is arguing that it should be delivering and administering the program. And of course, you can guess that there were 2 different political parties in power on the 2 different islands. This would have been the time of Orville London and being the chief secretary, and Kamala Persad, Mrs. Kamala Persad Bissessar as the prime minister. So there was that, the reforestation program. And the matter went to court, and Justice Kangaloo said, yes, but we have to look at your section 75(1), because it always goes back to the executive authority of the state. The day-to-day administration of the state is performed by a cabinet. So notwithstanding anything else, the buck is always going to stop there. I remember that I can't remember a journal article that I would have read a couple years ago emanating from the UK. I can't remember lady who wrote that article, so forgive me. But why I remember it is not only because I used it I referenced it in a paper I wrote on the issue of self-determination, but it was profound what she said. She said that she believes that legislation dealing with matters of decentralization and devolution of authority should not be interpreted in the same way you normally interpret legislation. That the rules of interpretation, though they are pieces of legislation, should be different because you're dealing with decentralized authority and devolution, matters of devolution. This was sort of hinted, or not said in the same way, in one of the cases quite a bit of time ago, between the Tobago House of Assembly and the Attorney General, because there are always going to be issues which come up. Because I remember when I was on the previous episode dealing with this issue of autonomy, what you have is a unitary state that has some, or pretends rather to have some quasi-federal operations. But you're always going to come back to the fact that there is your section 75(1), which states clearly in your constitution that the responsibility, executive authority, the administration of the state is to be done by your cabinet, right? Your prime minister and his cabinet. So notwithstanding anything that may be in a Tobago House of Assembly Act, at the end of the day, the buck would stop with the cabinet. And you go before any court, that may most likely be the conclusion, unless there is some sort of change constitutionally. And that is why every time there is in the public space conversations about self-determination and autonomy for Tobago, you always hear some some persons saying, notwithstanding any legislative amendments, there must be constitutional changes. Otherwise, certain kinds of problems would continue to persist. But if you're talking constitutional changes, it may mean that you are moving towards something that is more akin to a federal system rather than a unitary state system, which is what we have now. So there are always going to be issues. I am certain there are issues when the same parties in both places probably may not bubble over into the public space, but I am certain there are issues. Just recently, I think it was last week or last weekend or last week, the Minister of Public Utilities was in Tobago opening some WASA booster stations in Tobago, or well, at least one. And then it came out during this week, because everyone noticed that the assistant secretary or the secretary for public utilities, neither was present, right? And it came out in the public space that the assistant secretary was not invited, or rather was invited and disinvited. And the conversation in the public space was, here is this PNM administration doing the same, in quotation marks, disrespectful things that it complained of when Mr. Orville London was the chief secretary and Mrs. Kamala Persad-Bissessar was the prime minister. So you see, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But it's always going to come back to your Section 75(1), because we're dealing with politicians.
Talk to us a bit about the opposition. I know we spent a lot of time talking about the Executive Council and the Chief Secretary and so on, but I know that there is a minority leader. Is there anything else you can say about the opposition? Do they have any subcommittees that the minority leader serves on or anything like that?
Well, there's a minority leader, and as I mentioned, the minority leader, there's one minority councillor. So because of the election, which is 14-1, so there's one person elected on the minority side who is the minority leader, and there is Miss Petal Daniel Benoit, who is the minority councillor. Now we have Mr. Watson Duke. I don't know what to call him. He might be in purgatory because because he no longer sits with his PDP colleagues, but he sits, well, the assembly chamber, it's a horseshoe shape. So really and truly, he should be sitting with the minority, but he sits in between the minority councillor space, a little space, and then the last person for the executive, right? The assemblymen on the other side. It's not like how Parliament is, where you have two different sides in the House of Representatives. It's a horseshoe. So that in itself is supposed to suggest to you that people are supposed to be working together. There's no strict demarcation. So that's why I said he's sort of in purgatory. In terms of committees, there may be, but I haven't. I am open to correction, but I have not heard that these committees have been functioning or peopled or anything just yet. I haven't heard that, but there may be committees, yes. But I did hear the chief secretary say recently that he intends to include the minority leader on conversations they're having in terms of national security issues in Tobago, which is not really the remit of the Tobago House of Assembly. But of course, who feels it knows it. So if you live in the Tobago space, you can't just throw your hands up in the air, especially when you have what is a high number of murders in Tobago for the year already. I think it's 10. You can't just throw your hands up in the air and say, well, that is a central government function. You, as they are trying to do, attempt to work together to see what can be done at their level to arrest the situation or stem the tide of murders. But of course, yes, there would be allowances for committees and so on. As I said, I off the top of my head, I do not recollect that that at present there are committees here. So, but you, of course, because it's a quasi legislative chamber, that is the Assembly Legislature. There's question time, questions posed by the minority and so on, questions to the Chief Secretary, questions to assemblymen at the sittings. And the sittings are the last Thursday of every month, unless there is some special sitting which may come up at a particular request. But of course, you have to be mindful that every Westminster or Westminster Whitehall, according to Professor Gani, he would argue, these systems, there must be something built in for keeping your executive accountable and for so as I said, similar as to in Parliament, there is privilege in the House, and there is also the fact that you have question time and so on, and rules, standing orders which regulate your assembly legislature.
Right. Now, one of the things I always find interesting is the whole idea that arises during budget time. So in Tobago, they will make their budget, and then after they present the budget, it is said, we are hoping that central government would give us what we are asking for. So I wanted to talk to us a bit about the law concerning the budgetary allocation to Tobago, and also give us a bit of the historical context, because I always hear they reference the Dispute Resolution Commission and all these different things like that.
Yeah, well, yes. So remember I said that the Assembly Legislature is quasi-legislative, is a quasi-legislature. And this is one of the ways you see it. Remember, a budget being read, it's a bill that has to be passed in Parliament, right? So if your Tobago House of Assembly does not have that same legal authority, then whatever you pass for a budget or whatever passes for a budget in Tobago has to go somewhere else. Meaning it goes to the Minister of Finance, because remember I said before, assembly bills go to cabinet, in this case go to the Minister of Finance, and then there are conversations and so on. Again, there are always issues, because there are always going to be issues, because you can, as the Chief Secretary or Secretary for Finance, as the case may be, in this instance, in this assembly, the Chief Secretary is also the Secretary for Finance. But in the past, as I said, you may have had a Secretary for Finance who was not the Chief Secretary. We had Joel Jack before him. We had, not Mr. London, Mr. London's cousin, Dr. Anselm London, who was the Secretary for Finance and so on. So you come to the House, the Assembly Legislature, and you read this budget, lofty, and there's desk thumping and so on, but the buck does not stop with you. The buck doesn't ever stop with you, because it has to go to Trinidad, your central government, for determination, your Minister of Finance. And that in itself, anytime you're talking about money, there's always going to be dispute. So you mentioned the Dispute Resolution Commission, and the Section 56 of the THA Act provides for the establishment, or provided for the establishment of a body known as a Dispute Resolution Commission. And the purpose of this commission is to resolve disputes between the Assembly and the government on budgetary allocations to the Assembly and matters in connection therewith. Now, so persons like me who are a little more seasoned may remember when Mr. Hotroy Charles was the Chief Secretary. I think he was the first Chief Secretary. And Mr. Basdeo Pandey, I think it was the Prime Minister. And there were issues regarding Tobago's allocation, budgetary allocation. But on September 14th, 2000, the DRC, Dispute Resolution Commission, issued a report on the appropriation, to finance development and recurrent expenditures in Tobago. And the report stated inter alia that a percentage of the total budget in the range 4.03% to 6.9% of the national budget, 4.03 being the minimum, should be allocated to the Assembly to cover both the recurrent and development allocation in each financial year. And of course, this should be reviewed from year to year in light of the prevailing circumstances. Now, we are lawyers, so you know these little nebulous phrases: to be reviewed from year to year in light of prevailing circumstances. Who determines what those prevailing circumstances are? And I say this because just last week, the Chief Secretary was in the Assembly legislature because he came back to the House, to the legislature, the Assembly legislature, because after giving a lofty budget in, I think it was June of this year, the allocation was not as he would have liked or preferred. So he had to reprioritize and realign and so on. So he came back to the House to say what those realignments would be. And he said something that stuck at me from a legal perspective. Not the politics and the grandstanding part of it, but this part, where he said that for the last few years, notwithstanding the allocation that is stated by the Minister of Finance in Parliament, Tobago has not received its full complement. Now, I just said to you what the DRC said, 4.03 being the minimum. Most times, what is said in the budget and as being allocated to Tobago is at that minimum. Most times, or very close to the minimum. I've never heard it reach the upper limit, which is the 6.9, right? Most times it's at that lower minimum. So it's stuck in my head because I said, if you're already so dangerously close to the minimum, if not on the minimum in terms of what you're saying you're allocating, if you do not allocate what you said you're going to allocate, does that mean you've run afoul of the law? And what the Dispute Resolution Commission has said should be the minimum? That's the food for thought. And there's another thing that stuck in my head. See this thing about the prevailing circumstances? I thought of it when the Chief Secretary said that, very often the allocations are very close to the minimum and so on. But the prevailing circumstances to him in Tobago are that Tobago is behind developmentally. Tobago is, and even more so now, he pointed out with the recent bad weather, a lot of the infrastructure was damaged, roads collapsing, landslides, and so on. So that the prevailing circumstances now, according to him, should warrant a greater allocation. But I just put that in the mix there because this is a legal podcast. And yes, it's politicians saying it, but when we look at what is provided for in the law and we're speaking about budgetary allocations, there are interesting arguments to be had. Interesting arguments with regard to whether the prevailing circumstances are such that there should be more than the minimum, towards the higher limit. Or is it the case that the central government has run afoul of the law in not providing the stated budgetary allocation to Tobago such that it falls below what is supposed to be the minimum, the 4.03? So those are the things that engaged my mind. Perhaps I needed some more sleep or something. Why should those things engage my mind? But I thought of them because, of course, I'm an attorney.
Great. Well, Adanna, this has been a great discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I know all of those of you listening out there will be enjoying it as well. But all good things must come to an end. So I would just like to thank you today for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with me again on the podcast. I wish you all the best in your endeavors, and I hope to have you on the practice when we start on the podcast when we start our season 2 in the new year.
Thank you very much for having me. And I would just say, a lot of this episode, which deals with the workings of the Tobago House of Assembly, would be indicative of the things that people generally do not concern themselves with and do not understand. So sometimes when things erupt politically, they may not have an understanding of what is happening. And I say this because we had some eruptions with an E, recently in the political sphere in the Tobago House of Assembly with Mr. Watson Duke, no less a person than him. And, if it were the parliament in Trinidad, it may have ended in a very different result. But those are not considerations that those same things in terms of crossing the floor or any of those kinds of things do not similarly obtain in the Tobago House of Assembly. So it's I just want to say thank you to you for inviting me to this so that I can provide some elucidation, some context, and some understanding to persons who always hear about this Tobago House of Assembly, but may not really understand and appreciate how it functions, what it does, and what obtains in the Tobago sphere, and why some of the things that are said publicly or not said publicly, but are seen publicly, occur. So thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation, and I wish you and your podcast all the best in the new year and in the future generally. Thank you.
Thank you for your kind words. Now, folks, this has brought us to the end of another episode of the Legal Corner podcast series. If you enjoyed the show, we'd like to ask you to share it with your friends and family. We'd also love it if you subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss any of our future episodes. Special thanks to the members of our promotional team who are helping us to get our message out. We have one more episode before we bring the season to a close, so stay tuned. Bye for now, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to the Legal Corner podcast series. For more information, please visit us at our Facebook or Instagram pages or send your comments to thelegalcornerpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you.